the technical developments and the research mind and the education that Tim provided was an absolutely essential part of how my group worked. And sometimes when I go to big international conferences, people ask me, so how do you go about becoming a successful scientist? And my first answer always is, you find a person that translates your crazy ideas into reality and makes things happen. And that's been the thing for me. But I want to start out a little bit. I'm going to be quick here. So HPL annual report, so that's the year when Tim came. Dr. Nick was the director of the lab, said, you know, the three highlights for the year were the International Olympic Committee research projects, preparing athletes for the Winter Olympics in Calgary, and the new laboratory. Because in 1987, 1988, we had moved into this space, downstairs in this one, not the top three. And the move was from a very small little area behind the old service area that still exists in the old block there, a little tiny room. So that was a real advancement to coming here. In 1988, as I said, Dr. Nick was the director, and we had, I think, 6 or 7 associates. I'm one of them there. These are the people that were here at the time. And then there, among the assistants, there's Tim Leonard from August 1988. So that's where he appears in the annual report for the first time. We had 6 graduate students at the time. I highlighted Linda Reed. Linda Reed was my first master's degree student. So the laboratory consisted of these 6, 7 people, 7 students, and then some research assistants. So that's how it was. So my contribution to the annual report was, and so that's what I wrote in 1988, you know, the little thing that you always write at the beginning, you know, to do direct force measurements, individual muscles of the cat hind limb, to look at mechanical properties of human skeletal muscles, and to do structural mechanical properties and relate them in muscles. And so I looked at that in 1988 and go, I could write that today, the same thing, and it would be essentially still true. So Tim made a lot of things happen and reality in the laboratory. And this was the first paper we published together, validation of optimization models that estimate the forces exerted by synergistic muscles. I had done some optimization of what we call in biomechanics, the distribution problem. And then with Tim's help, we were able to measure multiple muscle forces in the cat hind limb and EMGs. And you know, this is a slide that I have shown many times. With the animal walking, 4 force measurements, 4 electromyographical measurements. Then we added sonomicrometry and other things to that at one point. Then we get all these things: EMG, muscle force, muscle length, fascicle length. And then I also was very proud. I also thought that was the most beautiful finding we ever had, which shows how in the hind limb, the soleus muscle and the medial gastrocnemius muscle, how they share force. And what you can see here is that when the cat is standing still, you only have soleus force and no gastrocnemius force. And when you have paw shake, you only measure gastrocnemius force and no soleus force. And anything in between, depending on how fast the animal walked or ran or jumped. And to this day, I don't think there's a single algorithm that can predict that type of a variety of behavior among synergistic muscles, although I'm always happy to see that people use the Crown Shield and brand in OpenSim, which gives garbage results that get published everywhere and anywhere. So it's good to see. So then we went into the EMG force relationship, and I call these the 36-hour experiments, because we did experiments over in Manuel Hulliger's lab, and Tim did the isolation of single ventral root filaments and motor units, so he could activate them in any way. While he did all the heavy labor, I just did the easy stuff and isolated the muscle for repairing. And then Yuan Ting Zhang provided us with this fabulous software that allowed us to stimulate these individual alpha motor neurons at any frequency with any interpulse interval that we wanted in any way we wanted. And then we're able to have, very few pulses per second and see what the force does, or many, many motor units activated more like you'd activate a muscle and then get a steady force. And 36-hour experiments, because we kind of left off at 6 or 7 in the morning. And then by the time all these individual motor units were isolated, it was usually about midnight or 2 in the morning of the following day. And then we usually went, so like from Friday morning at 6 till Saturday afternoon at 2, 3, 4. We always said we go as long as the muscle holds up. But then that never was true. The muscle always held up longer than we did. And then the next big step, from a technical point of view, was that this is 1993, and wireless didn't really exist at the time. And then Anje Stan and Tim Leonard produced this wireless telemetry system to transmit forces and EMG signals in 3D moving animal. I'm not 100% sure if we were the first ones, but I think we probably were the first ones to do that. This is how the first system looked like, and now when we do these experiments, it doesn't look so different today. So you're kind of stuck with the same thing. And then a bit later, this is the first paper that in a whole series of papers that I did the research and the experiments with Tim on what we call history-dependent properties. And that was the first paper, depression of Katz-Leer's forces following isokinetic shortening. And there we worked together on elucidating these properties. And then came really the paper that changed it a little bit all. It was published in 2002, but really the work was done in about 2000, where we discovered that something funny happened when you stretch the muscle actively. And for those of you in muscle mechanics, I've seen this many times that I showed this. We got this remnant passive force after an active stretch that just didn't really fit into anything that ever anybody had published or said about muscles. And that's then the first time we went out on a limb and said, we think there is a passive element that somehow changes its properties when you activate a muscle. So in other words, you can measure passive force in a muscle, but when you activate the muscle and it moves, the passive force is actually very, very different. And therefore, whatever you call active force is actually not the active force, but it's the total force with an unknown active force, with an unknown passive force. And the implicated titan might be the thing of that. And once we said that, then it was a logical step that we had to go to single fibers, which then Tim built the system, bought the system and learned. And we needed to go to single myofibrils, and Tim went to Jerry Pollack's lab, looked at it, photographed it, learned it, brought it all back here. And the initial idea was in about 1999, and I always say the first paper published that was about 2007. So it took 8 years from an idea to then the first publications. And this was the first paper in 2003, but that work was done in Jerry Pollack's lab. That was not done in our lab, and so our first work came out later. And then, they talk about 1905, Annus Mirabilis, the miraculous year for Einstein, when he published his 4 famous papers. And the Annus Mirabilis for Tim was in 2010, when he published these 3 papers from his thesis. This one showed that titan clearly changed its stiffness upon activation. This one was first ever work on an isolated, mechanically isolated single sarcomere. And nobody has been able to do that work except for Tim and then Dilson Rossier's lab in McGill. But I always say the caveat there is that the system from Dilson was built here, we shipped it there, then Tim went there for 3 or 4 weeks and built it all up. And then Azim went there and wrote all the software. And so I feel like that work was also from our lab because Tim and Azim really made that happen. And this is then roughly how it looked like if this this is working, maybe it doesn't, maybe the thing made it. See if this works. No, doesn't seem to work. That shows how Tim captured a single myofilament, a single sarcomere, mechanically isolated it, and then did some testing. And that was, you know, from 2004 to 2010, the master's PhD degree. And I just want to emphasize the quality and the novelty of the results. So Tim won the new investigator award in 2004, the Canadian Society for Biomechanics, on the master's level. He was still a master's student then when he started. Then in 2006, he was the second place winner at the International Muscle Energetic Conference. And then in 2008, he won the new investigator award on the PhD level at the American Congress of Biomechanics, were given by the Canadian Society for Biomechanics. I think he might be the only person in Canadian history to win the master's and the PhD award from that organization. And then won the J.B. Hine Research Innovation Award. And now they give several awards per year, but at that time, they only gave one award for the best thesis. So every faculty submitted a thesis, you know, that was selected in kinesiology, then Tim's went forward, and then among the 14 or so faculties, a winner was identified, and Tim's thesis won that. And then he also won this WAGS Technology Innovation Award, and you ask yourself, what is WAGS? So WAGS is the Western Association of Graduate School prize for best thesis and best technological innovation in a PhD thesis. And these are the Western states that compete for that in the US, and the Western Canadian provinces that win for that. And then Tim got to present this at a conference in Colorado. Everything was paid for, and the best thing was the supervisor was invited and was free as well. And it's the only time that one of my students paid for my accommodation. Not only that, I didn't have to do anything because he was a celebrity and presented and did all the stuff. I just sat there and I was just kind of the spouse coming along. And then when we wanted to find out how chitin really behaves inside the sarcomere, together with Mike Duval, they developed this antibody fluorescent labeling that then showed that, as the title said here, that the differences in chitin segmental elongation between an active muscle and the passive muscle, essentially indicating there is something really funny happening with chitin in the active state. And then, you know, the antibody labeling, then the initial figure that we had there was like this, where you see the sarcomeres there and the striation patterns, and the highlights there are the antibodies that are at very specific points on the chitin filament. And again, you know, kind of a completely new technology that we have never used before. And coming to the end, you know, Tim will be leaving here, but he didn't leave us with a task in hand, because I was asking Tim, you know, I wanted to write another RTI NSERC grant, research tools and instruments. And the idea was that we want to combine our single myofibril work with preservation techniques, cryopreservation techniques that allow us to stop the muscle from its contraction at any instant in time we want, and then use high resolution cryo-EM that is now so good in the last couple of years. It becomes so good that it has a resolution of 1.5 or 2 angstroms. So it's an atomic resolution that then allows you to see the atomic details here, for example, of the thick myofilament. But for us, more importantly, Stefan Raunzer at the European Muscle Conference just showed that he can do that for multiple filaments in a sarcomere. And that's what we want to do. And Tim wrote all the technical aspect of this RTI, and I just wrote why this is really good. And so we hope that gets funded. And so if that gets funded, then Tim's legacy will play in over the next 10 years or so, because I don't anticipate this to yield a result in a year or two. I think this will really result in 5 or 10 years from now. But that's very long. So closing off here, a former student of mine, Megan Raskovich, at one point wrote this at the board. She said, you know, it's not all about papers, it's about people. And you know, in Tim's case, it's not all about papers, it's not all about technological development, but it's indeed about people. And there's many photographs that I could show, but I picked a couple that I think might be typical. You know, here you see graduate students and helpers and a postdoc laughing and smiling, standing by, and Tim is doing all the work. And I think that's been the situation more often than not. This is just a photo at Tim's place because he organized many end of year, beginning of year barbecues. You know, that were always attended by the group, and that of course is a special thing that always makes a group function as well. And then, you know, here I just said, and always to the end, you know, whatever Tim started, it always came out to a successful end, and I think he can be very proud of that. And I was the kind of the beneficiary of that. So that's really where we are. And so at this point, I'm going to give the word to Tim, but I thought I'm just going to make a little bit of a quiz here. And the quiz is, I just checked in my CV. It's not an up-to-date CV. I think it's about 2-3 months old. So account for that. Account for that. But I wanted you to guess how many times Tim's name is in my CV.
The order of the 1,000.
1,000? Any other guesses?
500.
500? Wow, you are a bit too high. I thought it was an incredible number. That was an incredible number. It's 316 times. So about 9 times per year. You know, and usually through obviously publications and presentations that he or people gave. So he is clearly more often in my CV, except for myself, but that doesn't count. And so it's been a pleasure. It's been quite incredible. I'm going to be feeling a bit lonely as of January 1. And, you know, maybe I just say this one little thing at the end here. At one point, I was considering and had offers to go to Europe, various places to go to Europe. And then I asked Tim if he potentially would be prepared to go along. And I talked with my then wife about it as well. And Tim said, yeah, I definitely will consider that. And then she said, of course he's considered that. You are kind of like an old couple anyway. With that, I would like to thank Tim for all the service, for all the friendship, for all the good things that he has done, and you know, and again, the success of our group is in very, very big part due to what he has done. So that's my side of the story, and now you're going to hear Tim's side of the story. Thank you very much for coming.
Stereo okay? Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. Super. So yes. I'm hoping this doesn't look like a tombstone. It's advancing. So, yeah, some of this is gonna sound sort of like a summary of what you've already heard, but Brent gave me this a month or two ago. He found that somewhere in an archive. And so this, of course, is Walter's thesis from the University of Iowa, and it describes this issue in muscle physiology about individual forces. He's talking about athletic movements, but of course it's force share. It's how different muscles that share the same joint contribute to the forces that joint produces. So that's Walter a few years ago. In 1988, as Walter said, in 1983, I started in clinical neurosciences with Andy Hoffer, and we developed and built up his lab and did some experiments. So there, it was more focused on neurophysiology, and it was more on essentially understanding how reflex actions and stroke, analog stroke, would affect the excitation of reflexes in muscles. But in 1988, I needed a change, and so I came to physical education. That was phys ed at the time. And in 1988, I was volunteered in the cross-country ski timing up at Canmore. So I was up at Canmore during the Olympics, doing manual timing. Back in 1988, no one trusted electronic timing because a snowflake could trick the system. So we had electronic timing. We had people with Longines watches timing the events, and 8 out of the 10 times, the final results that came in were all from manual timing because the electronic timing could be tricked by flicking your pole. And if it was a snowy day, it just simply couldn't work. So of course things have changed now, but I had a wonderful time up there over the 10 days of the Olympics. And then I came to the HPL in the fall of that year. And I came over at the same time as Warren Veal, who he was I had sort of two department heads, two fathers in medicine. One was Bob Lee, who's a neurologist and who's head of clinical neurosciences. And Warren Veal was head of medical physiology. And since Andy had dual appointments, I had two department heads in my unit. So Warren came over at the same time, and in some ways, I knew him because we would have lunch together outside his lab. It's a very different environment than what the HPL was when it came to. But so I felt like I was coming along. I didn't feel sort of like I had jumped ship completely. So, but anyway, the lab was pretty empty. We had lots of space, as Walter said. The number of people here was relatively small. But we didn't do any of the work that we then proceeded to do here. But I did have in the back biochemistry lab, 104, tucked away in the corner back there, which was Dave Smith's blood biochemistry lab. And Delia Roberts was the technician at the time. I had a little 5x5 little spot next to the sink where I could fabricate the sensors that we were going to use in our experiments. And I had an oven to cure the epoxies, and I had a fume hood. It was the only fume hood in physical education at the time, so that the solvents that I was using could be handled safely. So I had a little space tucked away in the back corner, but it was enough. It was enough to be able to develop the sensors that we would need for these experiments. So, force sharing between muscles. So, I mean, really, the question is, what forces do individual triceps muscles contribute during locomotion in vivo? And so, considering that the soleus and the medial gastrocnemius both come from the knee, one is a 2-joint muscle, one's a 1, but they go around the ankle. So they're kind of sharing the job of walking, but they're very different sizes, 5 grams, 25 grams. You think, well, the easy thing would be to just say, well, they just contribute proportion. Whatever force is produced at the ankle, they're contributing equally all the way along. And so we instrumented the soleus, plantaris, medial gastrocnemius, and the tibialis anterior for the dorsiflexors in front, and EMG and force. And it was a struggle to get it to all work. At the time, nothing was recorded on a computer, the lab where we were using Andy's lab, because Walter didn't have a lab at the time where we could do these experiments. And I can't find the exact model. This is out in somebody's dump somewhere down in the States. Strategic Air Command and NORAD used to use these to download satellite information from their spy satellites in the 70s and 80s. But it was an excellent machine for recording FM data. We could record 28 channels, so we could put integrated EMG in there using hardware to do all kinds of things, but you had to get it off of here somehow. And we used a portable computer that Byron will remember was more the size of a microwave oven and weighed just as much. But when we got it to work, we got 4 forces and we got 4 EMGs, and I just was ecstatic. After all kinds of issues, we finally had force and EMG data, and people are still asking for this data for 30 years later. And for a while it was on floppy disks. I think Hole has it now on some other format, but we got the forces, and Walter's already given me sort of the results, but to see that the proportionality of, okay, a 5 gram and a 25 gram must contribute equally as it goes along, but of course they don't. And these are speeds of walking on the treadmill, so 0.4, 0.7, 1.2, and 2.4 meters per second on the treadmill for a cat. And you can see that the soleus force is really hard to change. The gastrocnemius forces can increase and increase and increase, and that was a beautiful result, and it was consistent across all the experiments that we did. If we look at the gastrocnemius and the plantaris, while it's more of a linear relationship, those two seem to kind of go up in tandem. There isn't this issue of the soleus being an anti-gravity muscle that sort of is turned on and it can't kick any more into what's required at this really fast locomotion. So it was, at the time it seemed groundbreaking. But then once we had this technique working, Evelyn Hosler, PhD student of Walter's, came, and we carried this work further. And so she was interested, now that we had a locomotion model, we had the technology to work, we added on some new technology, an implantable force transducer for the patellar ligament. So we can now measure the forces above what the quadriceps are producing. And so Evelyn was interested in being able to take the model that we had, and I helped her with it, but it was her project. And we implanted not only force transducers as we had before in EMG, but we now can measure the forces in the quadriceps muscles. And she was interested in ACL transection, an injury model of how locomotion and force sharing change with the loss of a crucial structure inside the knee. And just from her paper in Journal of Mechanics in '97, she showed very convincingly that the tendon forces dropped enormously, the gastrocnemial forces dropped, and the EMG became quite sporadic in the quadriceps, as you would expect, 7 days post-injury. So she took this work further, and that was her thesis work. And it was a pleasure working with Evelyn. I believe she has 2 kids now, in Switzerland with Christoph, her husband. And haven't seen her in years, but it was a good memory, some of those times. And then later, we were in 2003, Matoshi Kaya came and continued this work with a slightly different question. And we were still measuring the direct forces from the tendons, it was still measuring EMG, and he showed that during steep uphill climbing, and it took a long time for him to train the animals to do this, is that the soleus force essentially collapses, and that the work is all being done by the neurogastrocnemius. So again, force sharing, they're not all contributing equally depending on the task. And so Mitoshi drove that work, and of course I enjoyed helping him with the project and with the surgeries and the experiments, and good memories. So then, changing gears from the in vivo to the in situ type of work. And Walter's already alluded to this, but history-dependent properties, it goes back to 1966 work by Gordon Huxley and Julian on the force-length relationship. And the argument And the theory that's generally accepted, it makes perfect sense, it's quite simple, straightforward, is that depending on the length of your muscle or depending on the length of your sarcomeres, there's only one force that can be produced isometrically. You have a certain amount of filament overlap, you're going to only have so many cross bridges formed, you're gonna get one value theoretically of force. So if you happen to be 3.6 micrometers, 3.7 in a frog, you're not gonna get any active force because the filaments are so far apart the cross bridges can't form. And if you're really short, you're not gonna get any force because everything's being crumpled up. So that's a seminal piece of work. It's a foundation of how muscle works and how we understand muscle. But even prior to the 1966 work here, others had shown, Abbott and O'Bear had shown very nicely that you could stretch a muscle after it was activated, allow these transients to fade away, and even though the lengths of the isometric and the after the stretch are the same, so there's the same point on this curve, or the same point on this curve, you get very different forces. It's just like, so well, how does that happen? Is this says that it shouldn't happen because you only have the same amount of filament overlap. You only have so many molecular motors that are available. Why are you being able to produce more force? And of course, the converse is true. If you shorten the muscle and you start at a long length and you shorten the muscle and end here, it matters whether you started and ended there or whether you started long and ended at the same length. You get less force. And so that's force depression. And again, kind of is a challenge for this model to explain. And it's like, so what is driving this? We'd like to know more about it. But for the purposes of today, I'm just going to talk about this stretching, about active muscle and the extra force that you get. So, whole muscle residual force enhancement experiments, we started them in the mid-90s. And it was, can we duplicate in mammalian muscle what was seen by Abbott and O'Bear in dogfish or in toad? And so we set up equipment over in what was called Gyard at the time. So over in the fourth floor of the Heritage Medical Building, it's a biomechanics lab there. And this was essentially a area that was Nigel Shrives and Cypher had set it up and we could access it. Marco Vaz is there, Walter's there, and I'm there. I think Paul took the picture. So we would set up these experiments. We would do, again, we didn't really have a lab for Walter, so we would do the preparation work in Bob Bray's lab, which was next door. And then we would come in here and do the experiments here. Now you can't see really what's going on there, that's probably okay. But we were interested in intact soleus muscle and 3D architecture using what was then relatively new technologies, soil micrometry, using crystals to measure distances inside tissue. So we did these experiments. They were long days. The lab was fairly heavily used, and because we wanted to do a series of experiments compressed in time to do in a week to try and do 4 experiments and get it all done with all the setup. It was very difficult and challenging to get that much time. So quite often we would have to do these experiments the week before Christmas. Because that's when the lab was essentially closing down. So Walter and I and Koa and Marco and whoever else was part of this project would have to work long days before a holiday. And I apologize to my daughter back there. I'm sure there was a day when I didn't get home till midnight on Christmas Eve. But she was little and she's forgotten me. So we set this up. And so yes, Walter's already given you the story of this, but we saw with different amounts of stretch, always to the same length, we saw different forces. And this was the passive force. So this is what we would get if we stretched and didn't activate the muscle. But depending on how much we stretch from 4 to 9, 6 to 9, 0 to 9, the magnitude of this stretch affects this extra force that we would see. And then Walter, so we got residual force enhancement in the whole muscle using electrical stimulation of the nerve. We can do all that. We can see residual force enhancement. But again, once we deactivated the muscle, we expected this to come down back to the passive force. And I remember when we saw that the first few times, I think Walter thought I had done something wrong, that I had not programmed the computer correctly and I was not shortening back to what I said. And we, you know, pulled up the data on the computer and I said, no, this stupid MTS software says this is where we're going. Actually got a ruler out, measured it to make sure that it was doing it, but no, this extra force was there. We measured the force with the load cell, we measured the force with the buckle transducers, like we got two force measurements, we get that same thing. What is this? When we deactivate the muscle, we have this residual force, but it's passive in nature. So, you know, does residual force enhancement have a passive component? Seems to be something that we should investigate. And so residual force enhancement had been explained by Dave Morgan and Louis Prosky as being due to sarcomere length non-uniformity. All the sarcomeres in the muscle have to sustain the same force. So perhaps the extra force we get, you know, in the dogfish muscle where you stretch, or when we stretch the soleus muscle or the cat, when we do it, perhaps it's cross-bridge mediated because some of the sarcomeres are a little stronger or in a better position to produce force, and then everybody has to carry that force. So if we start at a nice 4 sarcomere muscle, where everybody's equal, everybody's sarcomere length is the same, we will get some force because the average sarcomere length here is say 2.6. We would get that force. If we were to stretch that muscle and every sarcomere is again uniform, they're all the same length, but now they're a little bit longer. They're at 3.6. This is the force that you would get. You know, there's no hedging your bets. That's just the force you're going to get if everybody is 3.6. But residual force enhancement with this stretch is really this situation where if you stretch to this final length, that was kind of where you were aiming to go. But the argument is that one sarcomere becomes incredibly, insanely long, and the other ones are now just a little bit shorter. So that these three that are producing force are a little bit moved back here, so they're producing a little bit more force. And that was the argument behind the sarcomere non-uniformity theory. And it's quite an elegant explanation of the phenomena, but it had never really been investigated and observed to see if this actually is what's happening. Do we get, in a residual force enhancement experiment, do we get this sarcomere that stretches insanely long and allows the others to shorten a little bit to produce that force? So, to investigate that, we had to drill down to a much smaller architectural structural level for the muscle. And so going from the whole muscle here, we need to go down deep to fibers, fiber bundles, single fibers, even further down here to the myofibril level. And so these are myofibrils. These are just sarcomeres stacked end to end. The sarcomere is the smallest functional unit of muscle. If I have a string of sarcomeres and nobody else in the picture, I can measure each one of them and see if there is some non-uniformity developing. And maybe when I do my experiments on these, I'll be able to say, sure, I can see that. Here, there's no way I can see all 10 trillion sarcomeres that are inside a big muscle. But when I reduce the preparation down to this, of course, I can't see with my eyes anymore. My eyes were never that good. This is 100 times smaller than human hair. So it has to all be done on a microscope using specialized optics. So first question is, sarcomere length non-uniformity, is it real? Can I actually do something to a myofibril where I'll get different sarcomere lengths? So this experiment was, here's a myofibril. Lots of sarcomeres, I don't know how many are there. There's a needle here that allows me to control the specimen length. And then there are 2 cantilevers. These are silicon nitride cantilevers that are not commercially available, so we have to manufacture them. But the distance, the stiffnesses are known, and the distance between them initially is set. As force increases, this cantilever will move and it'll displace to the left, and then I can calculate what the force is. So I can see an activation, I can see what happens. So in this experiment, I set up the stream so that we could activate it, but only partially, in the hopes that we could produce non-uniformity. Does it even exist? there's a little bubble floating by, so you know this is plenty. So we can activate a myofibril. This half activated really strongly and shortened, this half did not activate. So we had two streams of solutions and we could deliver two fluids to try and produce the worst case ever non-uniformity, and we could do that. So non-uniformity seems to be something that is real, at least in conditions where we can control it. And so then the paper that Venus published, and I was fortunate to be a co-author on it, we worked together on this, looked at a situation where we had an active myofibril and we stretched it. So in time, this is time here, and this is sarcomere length. You can see that I've got 6 individual sarcomere lengths, 6 individual sarcomeres in the myofibril, and they start at different lengths, all the way from say 1.7 up to say 2.6. They're very non-uniform to begin with. They're activated, and then if I stretch them, will things get even worse? Will we get one of those sarcomers that stretches, really, really long? And so when we stretched it, everybody moved to a new position. They all got longer, but nobody went to 5 microns. Nobody stretched to insanely long lengths. And the strength of this thing is, I'm not showing you the force in this figure, but the force went up. But everybody now is on this weak descending limb of the force length relationship. I should have expected to have less force. We started with some very strong sarcomeres, able to produce 100% the normalized force because they're on the plateau region where there's the most filament overlap between actin and myosin. And when we finish the stretch, everybody is down here where things start to get weaker and weaker, and yet they're very stable. No one starts to just slide apart and pull apart. So it's like, okay, so not only are they non-uniform, but they're stable. There's no creep to somebody being pulled all the way down here and ending up out on the passive curve. So that was curious and needed more investigation. So I think my movie might play. In the previous one, I had 6 sarcomeres. Maybe if the non-uniformity of sarcomeres plays a role, I've got some give and take going on there. So really, it was Walter's idea, and it took me a long time to get it to work, but it was, if we're gonna see force enhancement, we're gonna see extra force with the stretch, we need to do it in a single sarcomer where none of the neighbors are involved in the final force that we get there. And so it was necessary to mechanically, I couldn't produce a single sarcomer and pick it up and hold it without damaging it. But I could mechanically isolate a single sarcomer so that I could reach up, I could grab here on the Z disc, just on the left side of the Z disc, to isolate this one sarcomer and then proceed with the testing on that. I had too much coffee that day, I'm a bit shaky. Okay, so now this sarcomere is attached between here and here, and then this needle was moved over so that there was no contribution of those 3 on the end. So we could now test a single sarcomere and we could activate it and then stretch it. And that's what we did. And what we found was that when we started when the individual sarcomere was stretched from optimal maximum strength all the way down to 3.5, where we're less than half of what the active force is, they actually got much higher forces, even higher than the plateau. We got some effect where we're getting an enormous increase in force with the stretch. And it's like, so sarcomere non-uniformity doesn't seem to be responsible for residual force enhancement if I can do it in a single sarcomere. So what is responsible for this extra force? And I've already, alluded to that, in the whole muscle experiments, that there's some passive component there. But there was also evidence that calcium increases tighten stiffness. Maybe the calcium inactivation is allowing the molecular spring tighten to produce this extra force. And so tighten, what is tighten? Tighten is a nonlinear molecular spring in striated muscle found in skeletal and cardiac muscle It produces virtually all the passive force in the sarcomere. This is an electron micrograph, so this is one sarcomere from this Z line here to this Z line here. This is not what Faizan has recently been showing me, but I'm sure at some point he will. And so we have the thick filaments here, we have the Z disc. This is the I-band region. Tighten all of this. Tighten here, this molecular spring has to fit in this space. Tighten is the biggest protein found in the natural world. It's enormous, nearly 4 megadaltons. The dalton is 1 proton, and most proteins are in the 20 to 30 kilodalton size. So this is an enormous slinky that's inside your muscle. And it has all kinds of different regions. Chris last week explained this very nicely in his seminar, but it is a spring and it fits in here. And as we stretch this muscle, this spring stretches. So as we stretch from one Z band to the middle of the A band, the tighten will unfold, it will extend, eventually it'll start producing passive force. So let's look at what the calcium might do to that. And of course, Jerry Pollock, I went to Jerry's lab to figure out how to assemble a system, and he came back, and by the time we put our system together, well, cameras had improved, computers had improved. We were lucky enough to take advantage of riding a wave of technology where we could put, a better system together than what Jerry had at the time. And then obviously working with Venus, coming up with the experiments to try and figure out what the effect of calcium was on this passive force that we saw. So it led to a series of experiments that I'd like to say, oh, this was all really well thought out. This is all how we were going to investigate it. But really, this experiment came from Walter saying, if we stretch a myofibril to halfway to hell and beyond, when does it break? And so I said, I don't know. Not something I would ever do. It's hard enough to lift them up. I would never stretch and stretch and stretch and see them when they break. But that's kind of what drove this experiment. But yeah, we find out when they break apart. But something interesting happened along that way. And so if we stretch the sarcomere from 2 to 6 micrometers, remember 4 is the end of active force. That's when all we have cross bridges that can work up to this length. But after this, there's no cross bridges contributing any active force to this muscle, even though you've got calcium present. And so the salmon colored box is kind of that space. But here, the passive force continues to rise as we would have expected, right? Obviously, there's low passive force. As we stretch longer and longer and longer, we get more and more passive force. It's all based on tightness. Tightness contributing that passive force. Then this is what we would expect. We would expect, okay, if we activate that muscle, it'll rise, we'll get active force. As we stretch it, there'll be more and more force. But eventually, once we lose this cross bridge ability, the force should just tank and just come back down, and we should get active forces that are what we call active forces, but they're the effect of the calcium stiffness on the tighten. That will be this effect, right? Its tighten is a little bit stiffer in the presence of calcium, but no cross bridges. We'll get this. But what we got was something very different. And so what we got was a continuing march of forces that went higher and higher and higher in an activated solution. Again, there's no cross bridges here, but we had this huge increase in force that I think you could argue is probably passive in nature because there's no active force being contributed, but there's calcium there. But it's an enormous increase that we saw. And the question then really is, well, how can tighten, being stretched to these long lengths, produce this increased force that we never anticipated? And so Walter and I, had a discussion, and we thought that the likely place, if we're going to speculate, would be that the long tighten that's in that I band actually ends up getting buttoned down onto the actin, and so that it can't move anymore. But what's left, this little remnant of the slinky, can produce a lot of force because it's being stretched more than it would have in that intact world, right, where there was no interference with allowing the entire spring to unfold. We don't have a very short spring that we're stretching. And so, more recent work has sort of suggested that this region of tighten called the PDK is the part that in physiological lengths produces the passive force in Titan, but there's a region called the N2A, or just to this side of the PDK, and there's been some speculation in certain mutation models of muscle, but that's perhaps a place where the Titan and the actin might interact and allow for this passive force increase. So that's kind of the end of what I've done. But now, from the summer, Naomi, who's a summer student with us, who was funded by Answer, is looking at something completely different. Looking at Titan and trying to understand what happens when you stretch Titan to really long lengths. And so Naomi's data here shows if we take the myofibril and we stretch it and we stretch it and we stretch it, we start to see something happening here. And so the Z disc, I'll just play that again. So these bands, these dark bands are retain their length, but a very, very thin band that's between them starts to get longer and longer. And it's all, and that's the Z disc. And conceptually, in mechanics, we think the Z disc is really a rigid structure that should not be, it's one wall between one sarcomere and another, but she's showing from the experiments we did here that perhaps that Z disc is extensible to some point, and maybe that will influence what Titan can do. So that's work that's going to go on, and she's analyzing that data now. Hopefully we can write it out. And she's shown that the Z disc here, this tiny little Z disc here, that's only about 100 microns in diameter, becomes much, much larger. And she gets lengths of these Z discs that are 1.8, 1.9 micrometers. And the question is, well, what does that do to the Titan? It doesn't have to stretch as far. So that's a road that will, well, I won't, but other people will travel. And Chris, a very gifted and talented student, has worked with Armand and looked at labeling Titan. And so he's labeled, remember we talked about the PDK in that part, just to the left of the PDK in that cartoon, where we might get interactions with the actin. He's labeled that side of the PDK of Titan, he's labeled the other side of the PDK to show how much the PDK is extending. And if the Titan is interacting with the actin, it will affect how much the PDK extends. So he's been labeled, they have been labeling, sorry, the two regions, and you superimpose these and then they do some analysis on there and they show the results. But that's Chris and Armand's story, so I'm not going to go into it. But I think it's exciting. It allows us to explore whether or not the speculation of actin and Titan is actually a real thing. And Walter, of course, talked about pride AM, so that's on the books for a year or two from now. And so then the last experiment that I have done strangely mimics the first one. I never really thought that the last experiment 3 weeks ago would be an in vivo locomotion animal model measuring forces, and this looks spookily familiar. But we have, Esteban and Siska, this was their project, so I'm not going to go into all the results. It's their story to tell, but after some tribulations and difficulties, we have forces, EMGs, we have tendon strain, we have forces, we have EMG and tendon strain in two different muscles in the hock area. So we have the psoas and we have the medial gastrocnemius. They're interested in hysteresis, they're interested in mechanical properties of muscle, but yes, back to this, and I'm just really familiar with this style of data. I mean, I look really old school, but it's a chart recorder, and I just like data that looks like it's on a chart recorder. So when I started, that's all we had. We had a photocopier type machine that spilled kerosene out and it electrostatically charged the solution we would get. But it came out on a chart and I could move the chart back and forth and everything. And so when we bought a computer that could display and collect this data, I made sure I found one where the data looked like a chart recorder, because I'm just comfortable with that. I don't like oscilloscopes. The data goes by and it's gone. You just can't find it again, right? You gotta download it, you gotta plot it. So it's been a journey. But everything doesn't always work out the way you plan. So I wanted to throw in that we've had some real interesting failures. And one of them is knee cartilage contact. Walter was very interested in understanding how knee cartilage would contact in a locomotion model. We can't just slip a piece of Fujifilm in there. We can't slip some kind of PDAR sensor in there. We've got to come up with some way to know what the cartilage thickness is. We need to know what the bones are doing. Video kinematic isn't good enough, so the cartilage, and sorry, my art is terrible, but we, the femur and the tibia have cartilage on the ends here, and that cartilage, when you walk, you know, it's compressed. And so understanding how the cartilage of these two bones interacts here was an interesting question. I can't remember why we were doing this. Do you remember, Walter?
We wanted to see, like also with ACL transaction, how the
Contact area.
contact area changed, and rather than using Fujifilm, we wanted to develop.
Yep.
There's Jack Tarfsky,
Yes, but those that were broke.
who produced sensors for us in a national laboratory in the United States that I found out then were used to measure the pressure under atomic warheads that they stored in the laboratory there where he was working, National Government Laboratory. And so then we had funded him a little bit, but then when we realized what they were actually used for by the American government, they told us that he had to give us all the money back that we gave him, and we had to sign a thing to not talk about it. My God, I forgot that I'm not.
It's only 100 people.
Or can you remove that? Anyway, that didn't work. So maybe it works on warheads. It sure doesn't work in this kind of testing. So the solution was to put solar micrometry crystals in little dental acrylic saddles on the bone. And each crystal could talk to each crystal across here. So we would get 9 unique measurements in real time at 500 hertz. And so knowing how these distances change would give us, if we scan these bones afterwards, scan them and got a complete, finite oval shape to them, and knowing where the cartilage is, in theory, we could say exactly where these bones are relative to one another in space. It sounded really good. We got this to work. I must confess that I only found these bones in my desk 2 days ago, and they're now in the biohazard bucket. I've forgotten that I had them. But this was done in 1999. So,
Maybe after 25 years, there's no much hazard.
well, the fat sort of went rancid. It wasn't pretty. But it was kind of nice to know I still had them, just in case I ever needed them. Like I said, they're in the old biohazard bucket now. So yeah, we would be able to predict exactly how these bones made contact and how the cartilage is loaded during locomotion. That was the plan, right? We would get this as the animal would walk. We would get these different measurements, and we could say, oh, okay, this cartilage now occupying the same space. It means it must be loaded. It must be being compressed. And so the cartilage being viscoelastic would compress, and we could say something about this region of the cartilage is being loaded, this part is not. And so that was what we were aiming to do, and Esther was part of these experiments. But it didn't work that way. It turned out that once we had scanned the bones, I had gone down to UC Davis to use their scanning system that they had down there. We take the bones. We already had the data. Of course, I took the bones. We scanned them with the cartilage on with a high resolution 3D scanner. And then we dipped them in bleach, and the cartilage just bubbles away and disappears in 2 minutes. And then rescanned them. And that gave us a discrepancy between the two files. So we knew what was missing was the cartilage. And then by using this data, we would say, oh, okay, we can figure out where the cartilage overlaps. Well, what we got was something where the bones had completely separated, And they were, 3 inches apart, which makes no sense. Or we got cartilage that was so crushed together that the bones were occupying the same space. We had terrible errors. And that was really due to inaccuracies in using the sonomicrometer. It was the fact that the sonomicrometer that measures these distances has an inherent weakness, which and Rashid, postdoc for Walters, spent months trying to clean this data up, but it became essentially unsolvable. Maybe there's a new way to do that, but back then it was unsolvable because the signal that goes from this crystal to this crystal, the one that's correct and accurate for that distance is the weakest reverberation of the crystal. And so the system wants a strong signal, so it would tend to lock into the second wave or the third wave, give us beautiful data, and it's really good at measuring changes in length, but it was terrible at measuring absolute length changes. And so we abandoned it. But I got an ORS abstract out of this with Esther. And what we found, looking at pre-ACL transection and post-ACL transection, so we recorded data, locomotion, and then we went in, cut the anterior cruciate ligament to produce this, essentially the ski hill injury model, allowed things to heal up, and we repeated the test. And what we found was that at the very end of the stance phase, when the foot is just about to lift off the treadmill during walking, there was this little rapid change, little short dip in the sonomicrometry distance measurements. There was some slippage occurring between the two bones that we would never have been able to see using video analysis. Putting markers on the skin over these soft tissues, we would have never seen that. But we did see it using sonomicrometry. We got these little blips that are not here in the healthy condition, but we would see this little shortening and then this extension that we would see. It was really interesting. And the ORS, we'll never do this again, but the ORS, I think, found that it was a novel technology and it was an interesting way to look at a problem from a new perspective. So it was, and I got to take my daughter to Disneyland because it was in action. So after 35 years in phys eds and / kinesiology, what have I learned? I've learned a lot of technology and I've had a lot of fun, but really it's the people that are the most important. People, I mean, I'm not a particularly gregarious person, but I've enjoyed working with so many people. And Glenda and Byron are there with their daughters. Thank you for attending today. Byron, the first analysis of that old force-sharing data was done on the lab's compact 386 running Lotus 123, which I thought was an amazing software, but nowadays no one would go there. But it was, once I got the data off the tape recorder and I had to do something with it, of course, needed to normalize the data, and Byron wrote me a code that allowed me to normalize all the data not in time, but in percent of the entire step cycle. And then I could analyze and I could overlay different steps and get the story out of that. I did it all on Lotus 123. I think there was a hard drive in that computer at the time, but anyway, it had an orange screen. It seemed like just like amazing technology at the time, but thank you, Byron. I wouldn't have been able to do that without you. And so, yes, Benno's here. Benno, did and still sets a high standard for the work in the lab. And he kept the place focused, no hats, no more hats. I don't see any, no, I see a few. Okay, well, things slipped a little. Old pictures, I tried to animate this so that these would zoom up and zoom down, but I really couldn't get that to work, so I just gave up and hoped that you brought your opera glasses. Kim Cole and Tony Guimaras there, fun people, great students. The students used to be much more fun because Tony was a terrible practical joker. Tony pulled tricks on all kinds of people. And then one time, the students, his compatriots in the office, moved his desk and his filing cabinet and his chair to the men's bathroom. He came into work and his space was empty. And he had to wander around and find it. It was in the men's bathroom right here. And he worked in there for half a day. So Tony, of course, Tony's not with us anymore. He was killed in an accident a few years ago. But we did those Ventroid experiments in Manuel Hulliger's lab, and you were not allowed to spin in your chair, because if you spun your chair around, the whole system crashed because of some static electricity. We had to reboot everything, and it was, so they were not just long experiments. When you're really, really tired, spinning your chair just feels good, you couldn't do that. And Vincent von Scharner, a very nice man, lots of nice ways of looking at questions in a different way that was always challenging. And Esther, and Tim Butterfield and his wife, another great, Tim was a great student too. Something about the name Tim, I guess. And then we got to go to the synchrotron in outside of Chicago. Amazing opportunity with Venus and with Sophie and Ian to be down there and doing high resolution, high brilliance X-ray work on structures and muscle and activation. Where else but at university could you really get the chance to do something fun like that? Andrew Huxley, of course, we had him here. He and his wife are wonderful people. I remember taking them to the Drumheller Terrell Museum for a day when they were here for the 99 ISB. Is that right, Walter?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Took them out there. There's a big statue of his grandfather, Thomas Huxley, out there. He said, "Oh, kind of grandpa." So no, very insightful, wonderful conversations, and not always about muscle. It was really interesting, man. And the other students, and Doug Bourne, Abe Sabo, new students, Shuye, Mauricio, Ruth, of course, is a key part of the lab. Wonderful, you're all wonderful people. And of course, Hank Grozier and Walter have helped me so much and directed me, my research interests and good advice. So at the end of the day, of course, Walter has given me enormous support and trust and friendship over these 35 years, and that has kept me here because this is an amazing place and the people are wonderful. The technologies that we have keep advancing, keeping pace. And this is not a silo world. Coming from medicine, I felt the work was very good, but the labs you were in, you closed the doors, you worked with those 4 people. You might see other people at coffee time, but there's no interaction. I always found it to be very, I don't think this is a verb, but siloized in the sense that you work in that space. But here, now that we have the 3rd floor, I don't have to do this work over medicine, but you can walk between different floors and talk to different people. And the scale that we work on is all the way from a whole human golfer down to, single actin mice and interactions using atomic force microscopes. So it's a wonderful place that makes this multi-scale and this multi-interdisciplinary environment. And you can't forget that not only is it what we have here, but we have amazing colleagues in Wissart and in biosciences. We have great people out at Spy Hill that help us do all this work. The university is really set up nicely to allow us to not have to develop everything ourselves, but to tap into the expertise and support we have from around the campus. So it's really great. And so what's next? Well, not this. I will not be driving on Coachella Trail at 8 in the morning in February in a snowstorm. So I'm not going to be doing that. I'll think about it very carefully, but maybe I'll do that. And I want to go to Hawaii. I've never been there. I want to go somewhere warm. I'm going to spend more time on my garden because, man, it's gotten short shrift these last few years. I want to spend more time in the summer, and I want to spend time with my grandson who is here today. So that's what I'm going to do, but I'm still going to stop in if you'll let me come to seminars and have coffee with people and see how things are going along, and I don't want to disappear, but I won't be doing it in a snowstorm at 8 in the morning, so as long as you're okay with that, thank you very much. It's been a good.
Questions or comments? The thing that just came to my mind when Tim showed the snowstorm there is that one day, there must have been end of April or early May, we had the biggest snow ever in Calgary overnight, it was like 60 centimeters or so. And Tim promised that he would do the lab for me because I was somewhere at a conference. And then I realized on the website there, the university is closed. And I told him, oh, lucky you, the university is closed. But of course, Tim said, no, I left home 3 hours early, made it here. And he offered the class to, I don't know, three or four students, despite the fact there were 60 centimeters of snow and few graduate students coming. The other thing that I might remark is that, unfortunately, I feel really bad about that, but the story about Christmas Eve is actually true. And unfortunately, we thought we would be home with our families at 5 or 6, but then something went wrong with the experiment, and we got midnight on Christmas Eve, which I think our family had a hard time for giving us. So we've done some crazy things. Any comments or any questions that anybody has or anything? We will have. Otherwise, actually, let's do it this way. So we have a little present, I think. Yeah, Barbara, thank you. And then after this, we'll slowly but surely take your time, go over to the last defense lounge, to the LVL. And then there will be a possibility, for having some drinks and so on. And also, there will be possibility then about telling some stories that you might have about him. As he was talking, there's just so many things that came to my mind. I was looking at Matoshi Kaya, who I always thought was a beautiful man. He suffered a couple of really severe injuries at work related. To this day, I feel very terrible whenever I see him, because I always feel that I always apologize to his wife that this beautiful man.
That's his big scar.
And on his big scar, and at one point needed cosmetic surgery because part of his nose was ripped off by a cat. So let's leave some things in the line. So, yeah, please, yeah, maybe on the rapid, yeah. So this is a little present that comes from the faculty and the university for Tim. And we're going to be very careful with it because similar present was once given about 20 years ago to a faculty member and then was dropped and broke, and so we want to make very, very sure that that's not going to happen. So give it to Tim. This is a soapstone
It's a
dancing bear.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you very much. That's amazing. I've always wanted some kind of Inuit art, because I find the forms absolutely sublime. And I won't drop it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Join us all at the LDL. There will be a little video show, and then, as I said, an open microphone and just casual chatting, and you can have access to Tim and tell him whatever he would like to do. Thank you very much for coming. It's great. I'm really happy to see so many people here. I understand there's several people online as well. Thank you to them for coming as well. And so hopefully you can all join us over at the LDL. Thank you very much again.